Picture this. September 12, 1683, Vienna burns. 300,000 souls trapped inside crumbling walls, starving, dying, watching as 80,000 Ottoman warriors prepare for the final assault that will break Christian Europe forever. The city has held for 2 months, but now the mines are set, the walls are crumbling, and the greatest Islamic army ever assembled stands ready to sweep across the continent. But on a hilltop 4 miles away, something catches the morning light. Something that will unleash the most devastating cavalry charge in human history. Something that will make the earth itself tremble. What happened next was so catastrophic, so utterly apocalyptic, that eyewitnesses would struggle for the rest of their lives to describe the horror they witnessed. This is the story of how 3,000 winged warriors became the instruments of absolute destruction, and how one charge, lasting barely 18 minutes, left the ground soaked with so much blood that it would refuse to freeze the following winter. The year is 1683, and the world is ending. Not slowly, not quietly, but in fire and screaming metal and the thunder of 200,000 boots marching on Vienna. For 2 months, the greatest fortress city in Central Europe has been dying by inches. Inside those walls, things have gone beyond desperate. They've gone medieval. They've gone primal. Let me paint you the real picture, not the sanitized version you learned in school. The bodies started piling up in the streets after week 3. Disease came next, riding on the backs of rats that grew fat on corpses the defenders were too weak to bury. By week 6, they were eating the horses. By week 8, they were eating the dogs, the cats, anything that moved. And whispers, horrible whispers, began circulating about what some were finding in the darkest cellars. The smell of death hung so thick over Vienna that Ottoman soldiers half a mile away had to tie cloth over their faces. 16,000 defenders remained from an original garrison of 20,000. 4,000 ghosts in the span of 60 days. But here's what's truly terrifying. They were the lucky ones, because outside those walls, in the massive Ottoman siege camp that sprawled for miles in every direction, Supreme Commander Kara Mustafa Pasha was preparing something that would make the siege look merciful by comparison. A man so ambitious that he'd sworn an oath before Sultan Mehmed IV himself that he would take Vienna or die trying. A commander so brutal that even his own men feared him more than they feared death. And he had under his command an army the likes of which Christian Europe had never seen assembled in one place. 80,000 frontline troops, elite janissaries whose training began when they were stolen from Christian families as children, beaten and broken and rebuilt as the most feared infantry in the known world. Sipahi cavalry, mounted warriors who could put an arrow through your eye from 100 paces at full gallop, artillery batteries that had been dragging monstrous siege cannons across half of Europe for months, and behind them another 60,000 irregular troops, camp followers, engineers, sappers, all waiting for the walls to break and the real nightmare to begin. Because when a city fell to the Ottomans after refusing surrender, there were rules, ancient rules. Terrible rules. 3 days of unrestrained pillage. 3 days where every atrocity, every dark impulse, every horror that men are capable of inflicting on other men was not just permitted, but expected. Vienna's fate wasn't just defeat, it was annihilation. It was every man, woman, and child either dead or dragged away in chains to slave markets in Constantinople. It was the complete erasure of a city that had stood for over 800 years. And Kara Mustafa had been dreaming of this moment for so long he could taste it. His engineers had spent weeks digging tunnels beneath Vienna's walls, packing them with barrels of gunpowder, enough to send entire sections of the fortification exploding into the sky. He had already picked out the palace where he would make his headquarters, already chosen which Viennese nobles would be ransomed and which would be executed as examples, already calculated how much wealth would flow back to Constantinople, how much glory would be his, how the Sultan would have no choice but to make him Grand Vizier, perhaps the most powerful position in the empire besides the Sultan himself. The date was set, September 12th, one final massive bombardment to open the breaches, and then the assault. By nightfall, Vienna would be a graveyard, and the road to Rome would lie open. But Kara Mustafa, for all his intelligence, for all his careful planning, for all his overwhelming force, had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed relief wasn't coming. 4 miles to the west, on the slopes of the Kahlenberg mountain, 30,000 men had achieved the impossible. They had marched through terrain the Ottomans had dismissed as impassable. They had coordinated armies from Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, and Saxony, forces that typically spent more time fighting each other than fighting together. They had covered ground in days that should have taken weeks, and leading the largest contingent, 18,000 battle-hardened Polish warriors, was a man whose very name sent chills through Ottoman commanders, Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland, 54 years old, veteran of 37 battles, victor of 37 battles, a military genius who had spent his entire adult life fighting the Ottomans and learning their tactics, their strategies, their weaknesses. A man who knew that on this day, on this field, the entire fate of Christian civilization balanced on a knife's edge. But even Sobieski, standing on that mountain slope on the morning of September 12th, looking down at the massive Ottoman siege works sprawling before Vienna, even he must have felt a moment of doubt, because the numbers were absolutely terrifying. His entire relief force numbered perhaps 30,000 combat-ready troops. The Ottomans had 80,000 frontline soldiers, and they held the defensive position. They had entrenchments, artillery emplacements, prepared fields of fire. They had supplies for months, and they had the momentum of 60 days of successful siege operations. By every rational calculation, Sobieski should have waited for more reinforcements, should have probed for weaknesses, should have played it safe. But Vienna didn't have time for safe. Vienna had maybe 48 hours before the final assault broke through, and then it would all be over. Every minute Sobieski delayed was another minute closer to the apocalypse. So, on the evening of September 11th, he made a decision that would echo through history. He would attack at dawn with everything he had. One massive, coordinated assault down the slopes of the Kullenberg, straight into the teeth of the Ottoman defenses. It was desperate. It was audacious. And hidden in his battle plan was a weapon so devastating that the Ottomans literally had no defense against it. The Winged Hussars. Now, here's where we need to understand something crucial, because Hollywood and video games have turned these warriors into cartoons, into superhero fantasies. The real Winged Hussars were so much more terrifying than fiction could ever capture. These weren't just cavalry. They were the product of over a century of Polish military evolution, designed for one specific purpose: to break armies. Everything about them, from their selective breeding of horses to their specialized 18-foot lances to their psychological warfare tactics, have been refined across generations specifically to create the most destructive shock cavalry force ever assembled. Start with the riders themselves. You couldn't buy your way into the Hussars. You couldn't inherit your position. You earned it by proving yourself in combat repeatedly against the absolute worst enemies Poland faced: Tatars, Cossacks, Muscovites, Ottomans. These were men who had killed before, many times, and who understood violence at a level that went beyond training. The minimum service requirement was 10 years of active campaigning. Most Hussars were veterans of 20, 30 years of near-constant warfare, and the training never stopped. Even in peacetime, they drilled formations, practiced their charges, maintained the split-second coordination that would turn them from a collection of individual warriors into a single, unified instrument of destruction. The horses were just as specialized, bred for size, for strength, but also for a kind of controlled aggression that's nearly impossible to train into an animal. A hussar's mount had to be massive enough to carry a fully armored man and smash through enemy formations, but fast enough to hit like thunder, and calm enough to hold formation in the chaos of a cavalry charge. They were trained from foals to respond to leg commands, because in the charge, a hussar's hands would be full, one gripping the 18-foot lance, the other controlling a saber or pistol. The horses themselves became weapons, taught to bite, to rear and strike with their hooves, to trample anything in their path. But it was the wings that truly weaponized terror. Massive wooden frames mounted to the back of their armor, hung with eagle or crane feathers that stretched 6 feet into the air. And when 3,000 hussars began their charge, when those massive war horses hit full gallop, those wings created a sound. Eyewitnesses from other battles described it as a shrieking, a howling, a noise that seemed to come from hell itself. Some said it sounded like 1,000 demons screaming. Others claimed it was like standing inside a windstorm made of rage. Ottoman troops who had never faced hussars before, who had never heard that sound, would break and run before the charge even reached them, their minds unable to process the psychological assault of that unholy shrieking combined with the ground-shaking thunder of thousands of hooves. The lances completed the nightmare. 18 feet of seasoned wood, tipped with razor-sharp steel, hollow and designed to shatter on impact. And here's the genius. A solid lance transfers all its energy into one point. but a hollow lance that shatters spreads its impact across a wider area. It turns a single thrust into an explosion of wooden shrapnel that would tear through multiple enemies. A hussar hitting it full charge with a proper lance strike could go through 2, sometimes 3 men before the weapon broke. Then he'd drop the shattered lance and draw a saber, and the real killing would begin. Sobieski had 3,000 of these nightmares, 3,000 hussars who had been specifically held in reserve, who hadn't been committed in the early fighting, who were fresh, eager, and about to be unleashed on an enemy that had never seen anything like them. But even with this weapon, the odds were still catastrophic. The terrain alone should have made the charge impossible. Dawn broke on September 12th with Vienna burning. Smoke from the Ottoman bombardment rose in thick columns, visible for miles. Inside the city, Count Ernst Rudiger von Starnberg, commander of the garrison, watched as another section of wall collapsed under artillery fire. His men were eating sawdust mixed with what little flour remained. Disease was killing more defenders each day than Ottoman attacks, and he had just received word that Kara Mustafa's engineers had finished mining the walls. The final assault was coming, probably within hours. But then, something changed. Ottoman lookouts on the southern edge of the siege lines started seeing something on the Kahlenberg slopes. Sunlight glinting off metal. Movement. Lots of movement. And then the flags appeared. The white eagle of Poland, the black eagle of the Holy Roman Empire, Saxon standards, Bavarian banners, and the Ottoman commanders, seasoned veterans who had fought across 3 continents, felt something they rarely experienced. Fear. Kara Mustafa received the news in his command tent, and for the first time in 60 days, his careful planning wavered. He had left minimal forces watching the western approaches, convinced the terrain was too difficult for a major army to cross. Now he had reports of 30,000 enemy troops in battle formation on the heights overlooking his siege lines, troops that had the high ground, that held the momentum, that were clearly preparing to attack. He made his choice: hold the siege lines. His 80,000 men were dug in, fortified with clear fields of fire. Let the Christians come down that mountain. Let them bleed themselves dry against Ottoman steel and gunpowder. The terrain would slow them, disorder their formations, and his janissaries would butcher them in the broken ground at the base of the slopes. It was good thinking, sound military doctrine. It might even have worked, if Sobieski was a conventional commander. At 10 a.m., the attack began. German and Austrian troops hit the Ottoman right flank in a grinding, brutal infantry assault. This wasn't glory. This was meat grinder warfare. Men stabbing and dying in trenches, fighting over yards of blood-soaked ground, buying time and attention with their lives. The Ottomans reinforced their right, pulling troops from other sections of the line. Then the center attacked. Saxon troops, supported by Austrian artillery, hammering into the Ottoman fortifications in a direct frontal assault that seemed like tactical suicide. But it wasn't about breaking through. It was about pinning forces in place, about making the Ottomans commit their reserves, about creating the perfect storm of distraction. Because on the left flank, hidden by terrain and by the smoke of battle, 18,000 Polish troops were maneuvering into position. And at their head, formed into a massive wedge formation, 3,000 strong, the Winged Hussars sat motionless on their massive war horses, waiting for the signal. The ground they would have to cover was a nightmare. 1.5 miles of broken terrain, hills and gullies, and small streams that should have disrupted any formation. Then another 1/2 mile of open ground directly into the teeth of Ottoman defenses. Under normal circumstances, no cavalry commander would even attempt it. The charge would break apart, become disordered, arrive at the enemy lines in scattered groups that could be defeated piecemeal. But the Hussars weren't normal cavalry. They had trained their entire lives for exactly this, for holding formation over broken ground at speeds that seemed impossible for such massive horses, for maintaining the wedge shape that would concentrate their impact into a single devastating point, for synchronizing their movements so perfectly that 3,000 individual warriors became one weapon. At 4 in the afternoon, Sobieski gave the order, and hell came down the mountain. The first thing the Ottoman defenders heard was the ground. Not the horses, not the riders, the ground itself, beginning to shake like the earth was coming apart. Veterans in the Ottoman mines, men who had fought at Belgrade, at Crete, who had seen every kind of cavalry charge the Christian armies could muster, felt something primal crawl up their spines. Because this wasn't the sound of a normal cavalry charge. This was different. This was wrong. Then they saw them. 3,000 nightmares cresting the ridgeline. The afternoon sun caught their armor first. 18-foot lances held vertical, creating a forest of gleaming steel points. Then the wings came into view, massive feathered arcs that made each rider seem twice his natural size, some unholy fusion of man and beast and bird of prey. And as they began the descent, as those massive war horses transitioned from trot to canter to full gallop, the wings began to sing. That sound, God, that sound. Imagine standing in an open field and hearing 1,000 eagles shrieking in rage, mixed with the roar of a windstorm, mixed with something that your brain can't quite identify, but your body recognizes as the sound of approaching death. The feathers on those wings, carefully selected and positioned, created a resonance that grew louder with speed. At full gallop, with 3,000 sets of wings all screaming in unison, the noise became a physical thing. Ottoman troops 2 miles away would later report hearing it. Some claimed it made their teeth ache. Others said it felt like their bones were vibrating. And the Hussars were still half a mile away. Kara Mustafa's commanders screamed orders. Artillery batteries swiveled, loaded with grape shot designed to shred cavalry formations. Janissary musketeers formed firing lines, their weapons the finest infantry firearms in the world. This should have been a slaughter. A properly defended position with artillery and massed musket fire should have torn the charge to pieces before it ever reached the lines. But the Hussars weren't coming straight. They were flowing. This is where the training showed, where centuries of refinement revealed itself. The lead elements of the charge, the tip of the wedge, weren't riding in a straight line. They were undulating, shifting, using every fold in the terrain, every slight depression, maximizing cover while maintaining formation integrity. When Ottoman guns fired, the Hussars split around the impact zones like water flowing around rocks, then reformed, never slowing, never breaking the momentum. Some fell, of course some fell. Artillery doesn't discriminate, and when a 6-pound ball of iron moving at supersonic speeds hits a horse, that horse and its rider cease to exist in any meaningful way. Witnesses describe bodies literally exploding, men and animals turned into mist and shattered bone. But for every hussar that fell, the formation closed up, tightened, maintained its shape, because they had trained for this, because they knew that stopping, even for an instant, meant death for everyone. The distance closed, 800 yards, 600, the shrieking of the wings now so loud that Ottoman officers couldn't make their orders heard. 400 yards, the hussars lowered their lances, 18 feet of steel-tipped death leveled at perfect horizontal, and the wedge formation compressed even tighter. 300 yards, Janissary musketeers fired a volley, smoke blossoming along the entire defensive line. More hussars fell, tumbling in sprays of blood, their massive horses crashing and rolling and taking down other riders in a chaos of screaming animals and breaking bones. But the charge didn't stop. 200 yards. The hussars were now moving at speeds that seemed impossible for animals that size. Modern historians estimate they were hitting nearly 30 miles per hour, maybe faster. With each horse weighing over 1,400 pounds and each rider in full armor adding another 300, you're looking at individual impact forces of approximately 20,000 pounds. Multiply that by 3,000. That's 30 million pounds of mass moving at 30 miles per hour, aimed at a fixed point. 100 yards. The Ottoman troops in the impact zone could now see individual faces, could see the hussars' eyes locked forward, could see the lances aligned with mathematical precision, could see what was about to happen, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. At 50 yards, the sound of the hooves drowned out even the shrieking wings. The ground was shaking so hard that men in the Ottoman trenches lost their footing. Some broke and ran. Most stood their ground because they were janissaries, because they had been trained since childhood to stand against anything, because running from the enemy meant execution by their own officers, and they feared Kara Mustafa more than they feared death. They should have feared the hussars. At 20 yards, time seemed to slow down. Ottoman soldiers watching from the flanks, historians who would later interview survivors, all described this same phenomenon, the world contracting to a single point of absolute violence. Some men prayed, some screamed, some raised their weapons in one final futile gesture of defiance. Then the wedge hit.
What happened next lasted approximately 18 minutes. But in those 18 minutes, the Polish Winged Hussars achieved something that military historians still struggle to adequately describe. They didn't just break the Ottoman line, they annihilated it. They created a catastrophe so complete, so utterly devastating, that it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe for the next century. The physics of the impact were apocalyptic. When the leading edge of the Hussar wedge struck the Ottoman defensive line, it didn't slow down. The first rank of defenders, Janissary infantry who had held their ground against cavalry charges from every nation in Europe, simply ceased to exist. The 18-foot lances, designed to shatter on impact, went through men like they were paper. A single lance could impale 2, sometimes 3 soldiers before the hollow wooden shaft exploded into shrapnel that became secondary projectiles, tearing through anyone nearby. The massive war horses didn't stop or slow. They trampled over the bodies, their iron-shod hooves pulverizing bone, crushing skulls, turning men into unrecognizable pulp. And that was just the first second. The wedge formation meant that all 3,000 hussars didn't hit at once. They hit in waves, each wave arriving a split second after the one before it, each wave driving deeper into the Ottoman lines. It was like watching a drill boring into wood. The first rank created the opening, the second rank widened it, the third rank drove it deeper, and the momentum never stopped building. Ottoman troops who weren't in the direct impact zone, who were positioned on the flanks of the wedge, tried to close in, tried to attack the hussars from the sides. This is where the sabers came out. This is where the real butchery began. A hussar saber wasn't like a European sword. It was a Polish sabla, specifically designed for cavalry combat, with a curved blade that could decapitate a man with a single stroke. And the hussars wielded them from horseback with a skill that bordered on supernatural. They had trained with these weapons since childhood, had practiced cutting patterns until the movements became unconscious reflex. At full gallop, a hussar could lean down and take a man's head off so cleanly that the body would remain standing for several seconds before it realized it was dead. The Ottoman lines collapsed inward, compressing, creating a density of bodies that actually worked against the defenders. Men couldn't swing their weapons without hitting their own comrades, couldn't retreat without trampling their own wounded, couldn't form defensive formations because there was no space, and the hussars just kept coming, kept killing, kept driving deeper into the Ottoman camp. Kara Mustafa, watching from his command position, saw his entire battle plan disintegrating in real time. The defensive lines he had been so confident in were being torn apart like paper. Units that should have held for hours were breaking in minutes. And worst of all, the hussars weren't slowing down. They were accelerating. Because here's what made the charge so devastating. It wasn't just 3,000 hussars. Behind them came the entire Polish army, 18,000 troops who had waited for the hussars to break the Ottoman formation and who now poured through the gap like a flood through a shattered dam. Infantry, light cavalry, artillery, all of it flowing into the Ottoman camp in a coordinated assault that Kara Mustafa had no prepared response for. The Ottoman troops who weren't directly in the path of the charge started to panic, started to run, and panic is contagious. Once it starts in one unit, it spreads. Men who had never seen the hussars before, who only heard the stories, who now heard that ungodly shrieking getting closer and saw their own troops fleeing in terror, made the rational decision to save their own lives. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. The hussars, having punched completely through the Ottoman lines, didn't stop. They wheeled around and charged again and again, each charge driving deeper into the Ottoman camp, destroying artillery positions, overrunning supply depots, killing officers and breaking command structures. Ottoman units that might have rallied, that might have formed defensive positions, never got the chance. The hussars gave them no time, no space, no opportunity to recover. And everywhere the hussars went, they killed. Not cleanly, not quickly. War isn't a movie, and the reality of what happened in that Ottoman camp was something out of a nightmare. Hussars were trained to kill efficiently, but efficiency in 17th century cavalry combat meant maximum brutality. Skulls crushed by maces, limbs severed by sabers, men trampled into the mud by horses that had been trained to target fallen enemies. The Polish infantry following behind the hussars showed no mercy to wounded Ottomans. This wasn't about prisoners. This was about revenge for 60 days of siege. This was about every city the Ottomans had sacked, every Christian town that had been put to the sword. The killing went on for hours. Ottoman troops fled south, abandoning weapons, armor, supplies, everything that might slow them down. Some made it, most didn't. The hussars, now joined by German and Austrian cavalry, pursued the fleeing army for miles, cutting down stragglers, overrunning baggage trains. 15,000 Ottoman soldiers died in the initial charge and the immediate aftermath. Another 10,000 were killed in the pursuit. Thousands more were captured. Many would spend the rest of their lives in slavery, a bitter irony given what they had planned for Vienna's population. By nightfall, the battlefield was a vision of hell. Bodies stacked so thick in places that you couldn't see the ground. Blood had turned the earth into mud. Wounded men crawled through corpses, calling for help that would never come. Scavengers, both human and animal, had already begun their work. The Ottoman siege camp, which that morning had housed over 80,000 troops, was now a graveyard occupied by ghosts and the dying. Kara Mustafa escaped with perhaps 30,000 men, most of them wounded, all of them demoralized. The army that was supposed to conquer Vienna, that was supposed to open the road to Rome, was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. As a fighting force, it had ceased to exist.